Here we're going to go over the second essay in my enumerated series titled Of the Fatal Inconsistencies in Saifedean Ammous' Bitcoin Standard. At the top of this essay, I have two quotes from Saifedean. The first one is a response in regard to Nash's ideal money and specifically his concept of an ICPI. Saifedean says, exactly, it's just another centrally planned currency based on ridiculous price stability index measurements, and he's extremely naive to imagine it can be done internationally apolitically. It's far closer to an international CBDC than Bitcoin. And I have Hayek under here, quoted from the denationalization of money. Experience of the response of the public to competing offers would gradually show which combination of commodities constituted the most desired standard at any time and place. Changes in the importance of the commodities, the volume in which they were traded, and the relative stability or sensitivity of their prices, especially the degree to which they were determined competitively or not, might suggest alterations to make the currency more popular. On the whole, I would expect that, for reasons to be explained later, a collection of raw material prices, such as has been suggested as the basis of a commodity reserve standard, would seem most appropriate, both from the point of the view of the issuing bank and from that of the effects of the stability of the economic process as a whole. So Hayek, in his denationalization of money, uses the same mechanism that Nash does. And Hayek is one of the pillars of the Austrian School of Economics, which Saifedean claims to be a professor of. And the second one, Saifedean says, what matters most in money is its purchasing power, not its quantity, and as such, any quantity of money is enough to fulfill the monetary functions as long as it is divisible and groupable enough to satisfy holders' transactions and storage needs. And underneath, Hayek, I can only say that I would not like to see what would happen if under such a provision it ever became known that the amount of money in circulation was approaching the upper limit and that therefore a need for an increased liquidity could not be met. Now we have the same device that I explained in the first essay, where the casual reader may not understand what has been said between the two here, but someone who is well read on Hayek can easily point out that Saifedean has made a critical error here. The first section, a possible fork in the Mises Institute. In a previous essay, and that's the first essay that we went over, we declared the Austrian, or more specifically the Misesian School of Economics, or specifically in our time the Mises Institute, must respond to the apparent discordance between the existence of Bitcoin and the claim of Mises that no money can arise without first being valued in the markets for its non-monetary value. We also introduced a concept we call Szabonian deconstruction and used it to show that the earlier attempts by Mises to resolve the discordance between Mises's text and the existence of Bitcoin are really actually wrappers, rather than what their proponents seem to want to claim them to be as proper explanations of the original intention of Mises. One such example is from Davidson. A recent controversy has brewed over whether or not the emergence of Bitcoin as a new medium of exchange is in accordance with the Mises Regression theorem. The main question in the debate seems to be, is Bitcoin valued in direct use? The present paper contends that with respect to the regression theorem, this issue has no bearing on Bitcoin's genesis because it is relevant only when a new medium of exchange arises out of pure barter economy. While Davidson means to argue that a proper understanding of Mises would show his original intention suggests Mises only meant to explain the origin of the exchange ratio of money for commodities and not for any time thereafter that another object might arise to be money. If the wording is confusing to the reader, consider Mises' statement here that after his reasoning leading to this, whatever it may be and however valid it may be, he concludes, quote, it follows that an object cannot be used as money unless, at the moment when its use as money begins, it already possesses an objective exchange value based on some other use. While Davidson means to argue her explanation is the true intention of Mises, with all bias and misinterpretation removed, we argue Davidson has instead added her own interpretation or wrapper not present in Mises' work. One might think that this would be a pointless, never-ending crusade to find out whose argument would win, and given the vast amount of relevant supporting literature recursively cited, one couldn't tell if such a conflict would ever have a hope of halting. However, the observation or suggestion from our point of view is that the school will now have forked between those who believe Mises didn't intend what Davidson qualifies as his intention and those who do. From our view, Davidson's construction, disguised as a deconstruction, will not convince the wisdom in the Institute. Thus, at best, it can only fork its energy, else they synthesize in strong consensus with the reality of Bitcoin's existence. In the meantime, on addressing inconsistent systems with new axioms. Here we are reminded of Gödel's discovery of the limits of a system's ability to state its own consistency and considering this concept as a survivability tool for cultures or systems of thoughts or belief. We want to frame cultures and systems of belief of what is true and false in a context of Turing computers that might decide these things. This is what we refer to as Szabonian deconstruction. We mean to explain historical phenomena in a way that we are more able to see the object in a useful Turing framework. With that in mind, and with a quote of Mises from our previous essay, we note the curious nature of his assertion of the strength of his system. Quote, "Its statements and propositions are not derived from experience. They are, like those of logic and mathematics, a priori. They are not subject to verification or falsification on the ground of experience and facts." And we said in our previous essay that Mises doesn't mean to add an axiom to his system here, but rather he's trying to express the notion that praxeology, to which his system extends from, means to extend logic and reason. Therefore, if done properly, one could make the assertion that even nature couldn't break the reasoning. To understand Mises clearly, if you are not experienced with praxeology, understand he's simply pointing to the nature of logic and reason, not how well he put it together. If Mises made a mistake with logic and reason, he wouldn't consider that a failure of his system. However, it's still a poetic experience to consider that a natural phenomenon, Bitcoin, forces praxeology to be updated, regardless that Mises meant to claim that such a thing can't happen. On the nature of praxeology. The Misesian school, then, and any school that extends praxeology, by Mises' account, means to extend their argument by reason alone, and doesn't believe that empirical evidence or natural observations can validate or invalidate their arguments. To some, this would seem illogical or unscientific. In a sense, it is the latter, but we mean to explain how it is not, since all science seems to confirm or deny its hypothesis with natural observations and experiments. But it's simply the extension or a different way of observing which equally views the statements that proper reason can be broken by observing a phenomenon. Our simple assertion here, then, is that to extend Mises and praxeology by empirical-based reasoning is to leave the school behind and your argument unsupported by it. But it's simply the extension or a different way of observing which equally views statements that proper reason can be broken by observing a phenomenon as invalid. Our simple assertion here then is that to extend Mises and praxeology by empirical-based reason is to leave the school behind and your argument unsupported by it. On a proper introduction to the work of Saifedean Ammous. And this is in fact what we will show that Saifedean Ammous has done with this narrative, the Bitcoin Standard. He has claimed to extend an argument from Mises, whom he referenced over 50 times in his book, using empirical points, which is, by the basis and standard of Mises, absolutely invalid reasoning. Furthermore, he has wrapped the history of money in a lens that is inconsistent with anthropology. In one example, we will contrast his story of the rhinestones with an anthropology paper that makes such a case about the injustice Saifedean is guilty of here. Lastly, we show that Saifedean has wrapped Szabo's work in a nefarious attempt to convince Bitcoiners to subscribe to his system. Thankfully, with our deconstruction, the brilliance of Szabo's work can begin to shine through and perhaps attract people that mean to spend proper time understanding it. Revisiting our notation for Szabonian deconstruction. Here we revisit notation from our previous essay with an example showing what we mean to inquire into. Saifedean wraps praxeology. We want to reveal what we feel Saifedean wrapped praxeology, Mises' system, with in order to make his argument so it can be shown what praxeology is without Saifedean's wrapper to those that are accustomed to see praxeology through his lens. We mean to show the following to be invalid. Saifedean wraps praxeology, praxeology wraps Bitcoin. Examples of points that don't support a praxeological based argument. Saifedean claims to be of the Austrian school of thought and references Mises often. However, his entire argument is empirical based. Quote, seashells are another monetary medium that was widely used in many places around the world, from North America to Africa and Asia. Historical accounts show that the most saleable seashells were usually the ones that were scarcer and harder to find, because these would hold value more than the ones that can be found easily. By examining the history of the tools and materials that have been employed in the role of money throughout history, we are able to discern the characteristics that make for good money and the ones that make for bad money. Only with this background in place can we then move on to understand how Bitcoin functions and what its role as a monetary medium is. Resolving Saifedean's construction of praxeology with the apparent discordance of his construction with praxeology with the addition of the axiom of consistency. We can sympathize with the unsuspecting Saifedean student who doesn't themselves understand or know of Mises or praxeology, and what Mises explains as the basis and nature of it. They might have felt that every historical example is quite obviously supportive of the reason that Saifedean extends. But it's certainly a mistake to assert, and thus it's a construction to do so, that Mises plainly states that praxeology cannot be supported or disproved with empirical evidence or facts, cannot be resolved by asserting, but the facts make everything seem so logical. To add such a wrapper is not only to defile it with inconsistency, but to trick its followers very nefariously and deceptively. We believe that Mises would agree, and we believe the Mises Institute will loudly and decisively agree when asked to judge so. On the Saifedean construction of the Austrian view of money. As Saifedean continues down the path of implying that historical examples lay support to the arguments he extends, we notice something about how he paints the concept of what is hard money and easy money, or good money and bad money, etc. Quote, other ancient forms of money include cattle, cherished for their nutritional value as they were one of the most prized possessions anyone could own, and were also saleable across space due to their mobility. Cattle continue to play a monetary role today, with many societies using them for payments, especially for dowries. Being bulky and not easily divisible, however, meant cattle were not very useful to solve the problems of divisibility across scales, and so another form of money coexisted along with cattle, and that was salt. Up until now, it seems the general Bitcoiner and Saifedean, as well as anyone from the Austrian schools that should take contention, has missed the aforementioned inconsistency in his presentation. But furthermore, we present the argument that the way Saifedean explains and draws out the concept of money would leave Mises in shock and horror. The idea that cows are good money because they can walk, and that they were not easily divisible, thus meant other money existed, etc., is absolutely an unfounded argument in the realm of praxeology. Whether the general reader or Saifedeans or Saifedean agree or not, the real relevant judge is the school he claims to represent. In fact, his entire book is a historical account to support the nature of money he describes in order that he might finally conclude that Bitcoin has all of the ultimate features of the ideal money. We assert, in regard to our claim about Mises Regression theorem, that Mises would argue everything Saifedean argues makes a good money is in fact what makes it impossible to become and thus be a money. Then, from here on out, we assume that Saifedean will assert the axiom that this system doesn't rely on praxeology, and so we will use praxeology also to help defeat it. A specific example of Saifedean making a mistake Mises warned against. In his book, Saifedean evokes a historical example. Quote, "The Yap Island chiefs who refused O'Keefe's cheap rhinestones understood what most modern economists fail to grasp. A money that is easy to produce is no money at all, and easy money does not make a society richer. On the contrary, it makes it poorer by placing all its hard-earned wealth for sale in exchange for something easy to produce." Consider this anthropologist Jo Walton's abstract and complaint from this essay entitled Bitcoin and Stone Money, Anglophone Use of Yapese Economic Cultures 1910 to 2020. Quote, "Recently, parallels have been drawn between Bitcoin and Yapese stone money. This article focuses on Fitzpatrick and McKeon's 2019 exploration of similarities and differences. The analogy between Bitcoin and Yapese stone money is based on proposed commonalities that are inaccurate, ill-defined, and/or trivial. However, this does not signal a need to redefine the comparison, but rather a need to reconsider the rationale for attempting it in the first place. Recent attempts to redefine Yapese stone money using terminology from the field of cryptocurrency reproduces a longer textual history in which writers from the global north have misrepresented Yap for pedagogic or polemic convenience. Examples include works by William Furness III, John Maynard Keynes, Milton Friedman, and influential macroeconomics textbooks such as N. Gregory Mankey's Macroeconomics. This history features frequent colonialist tropes of Yap, as well as the erasure of histories of colonial violence and power. More caution should be exercised in the study of pedagogic use of Yapese economic cultures, and greater effort should be made to center Yapese voices, acknowledge colonial context, and reflect positionality and uncertainty." Walton means to deconstruct. Past authors, most Austrian and non-Austrian economic schools wrap rhinestone history. We assert that Walton would agree that their deconstruction shows that Saifedean's argument isn't in accord with anthropology. Not only is his argument not supported by the economic school of thought he cites, because it functions on the axiom that his type of argument is not validly supported in their line of reasoning. Furthermore, the wrapper he puts on his historical observations make them invalid from an anthropological standpoint. The careful and clever reader, especially of the Misesian kind, would notice here we have effectively provided an example that would be satisfactory to Mises as to why one cannot support praxeological-based arguments with empirical observations, and bonus points for understanding that, by the system of praxeology's own rules, it doesn't matter if the anthropologist's arguments are valid or not. Note Saifedean's citation for the rhinestones example. Quote, "The story of O'Keefe inspired the writing of a novel named His Majesty O'Keefe by Lawrence Klingman and Gerald Green in 1952, which was made into a Hollywood blockbuster by the same name starring Burt Lancaster in 1954. That's his citation. Possible Saifedean constructions to save face. Because so many Bitcoiners or Bitcoin maximalists or others support and tout the system that Saifedean expounds on, we should expect from the natural attempt to survive constructions to arise that mean to resolve the discordance between Saifedean's work and the school of thought it purports to extend. One such axiom would be that Saifedean means to extend Hayek only, and not Mises, whom he refers to over 50 times. However, this is equally as problematic, as we will show later in this essay. We should find many people in this group find actionable discomfort in this deconstruction we make. Only in the sense of urgency and immediacy the final eruption of Pompeii's last view of an eruption inspired. I had to read this a few times to remember what I meant to say here. It's as if the city of Pompeii was used to the volcano bellowing sometimes, but the one time when it really started to go off, it would have taken time for the true fear and horror to take place. In this view, and in the spirit of Szabonian deconstruction, it is as if the Saifedeanians are left without a founding doctrine from which their religion extends. Their idol, their core axiom, has been smashed. Like civilizations before, they are left to either attempt to adopt a superficial intersubjective truth that effectively only serves to hold order together by denying the truth of the natural phenomenon that proved the inconsistency, or to move on from their religion altogether, which is absolutely observably throughout history not our nature at all. Remember, we aren't ourselves praxeologists that deny a usefulness of historical evidence. On the historically observed metal quality of money as support of the Saifedean argument of good money and its praxeological failure. Notice Saifedean's historical account of the soundness of money. The denarius was the silver coin that traded at the time of the Roman Republic, containing 3.9 grams of silver, while gold became the most valuable money in the civilized areas of the world at the time, and gold coins were becoming more widespread. Julius Caesar, the last dictator of the Roman Republic, created the aureus coin, which contained around 8 grams of gold and was widely accepted across Europe and the Mediterranean, increasing the scope of trade and specialization in the Old World. Of this time he notes, quote, "Economic stability reigned for 75 years. Saifedean purports to deconstruct Keynes and attributes the devaluation of the scarce and valuable metal content of the coinage to the cause of the empire's historical decline. Quote, "With time, the old world no longer had prosperous lands to be conquered. The ever-increasing lavish lifestyle and growing military required some new source of financing, and the number of unproductive citizens living off the emperor's largesse and price controls increased. Nero, who ruled from 45 to 68 AD, had found the formula to solve this, which was highly similar to Keynes' solution to Britain's and the US's problems after the World War I. Devaluing the currency would at once reduce the real wages of workers, reduce the burden of the government in subsidizing staples, and provide increased money for financing other government expenditure. The aureus coin was reduced from 8 to 7.2 grams, while the denarius silver content was reduced from 3.9 to 3.41 grams. He continues and asserts the trend happens by the way of a trend of inflationism. Quote, "Under the reign of Caracalla, AD 211 to 217, the gold content was further reduced to 6.5 grams, and under Diocletian, AD 284-305, it was further reduced to 5.5 grams, before he introduced a replacement coin called the solidus, with only 4.5 grams of gold. On Diocletian's watch, the denarius only had traces of silver to cover its bronze core, and the silver would disappear quite quickly with wear and tear, ending the denarius as a silver coin. As inflationism intensified in the 3rd and 4th centuries, it came with the misguided attempts of the emperors to hide their inflation by placing price controls on basic goods. Saifedean always takes careful pains to make sure that he blames a Keynesian doctrine of money devaluation, which ruins the economic prosperity of the civilization the money served. With this fall in the value of money, the long process of terminal decline of the empire resulted in a cycle that might appear familiar to modern readers. Coin clipping reduced the aureus's real value, increasing the money supply, allowing the emperor to continue imprudent overspending, but eventually resulting in inflation and economic crisis, which the misguided emperors would attempt to ameliorate via further coin clipping. Ferdinand Lipps summarizes this process with a lesson to modern readers. It should be of interest to modern Keynesian economists as well as the present generation of investors that although the emperors of Rome frantically tried to manage their economies, they only succeeded in making matters worse. Price and wage controls and legal tender laws were passed, but it was like trying to hold back the tides. Rioting, corruption, lawlessness, and mindless mania for speculation and gambling engulfed the empire like a plague. But none of this is supportive of the praxeological view. By claiming to extend the Austrian school, it is strange then to ask the question of why Saifedean spent so much time expounding on points that don't support his argument by the Austrian school. In fact, it is Mises' point that it's an error to think one can do so. Does Saifedean dare say, sure, these aren't supporting points to my argument, but they don't hurt it? After wasting so much time expounding on the supporting historical evidence to his argument, we feel one could just listen carefully and a bit longer to hear him add, besides, after all, in fact, they do lend support anyways. Saifedean leaves the Mises system behind. On the Saifedean construct of the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Saifedean seems to have forgotten he claims to be from the Austrian school, making such bold assertions to suggest caution implies correlation. Quote, human civilization flourished in times and places where sound money was widely adopted, while unsound money all too frequently coincided with civilizational decline and societal collapse. More likely, he and his readership are engaged in careless cooperation where one can make baseless assertions such as the following as if they are proper and valid deductions of reason. Whether in Rome, Constantinople, Florence, or Venice, history shows that a sound monetary standard is a necessary prerequisite for human flourishing, without which society stands on the precipice of barbarism and destruction. These are rather statements that would get one kicked out of the Mises school, and it would be a travesty of logic to try and resolve the discordance by denying the very division between the praxeological and non-praxeological schools of economics. My axioms aren't inconsistent with yours, as a newly adopted axiom to deal with such obvious inconsistency isn't likely to mean. On the benefits of cows as money versus gold as money, as Saifedean is always on the historical lookout for the things that have the qualities of money that make it a good money, he notes of gold, in contrast to cows that, according to Saifedean, have the good quality of money that they can walk. Quote, instead of individuals having to carry gold and silver coins for large and small transactions, respectively, they could now store their wealth in gold in banks while using paper receipts, bills, and checks to make payments of any size. The holders of paper receipts could just use them to make payments themselves. Bills were discounted by banks and used for clearance, and checks could be cashed out from the banks that issued them. What is strange here is that he seems partial to gold in that as it passes its role to the paper that represents it, gold still remains the best monetary medium, even though it struggles in that it can't walk like cows or paper. Quote, this solved the problem of gold salability across scales, making gold the best monetary medium, for as long as the banks hoarding people's gold would not increase the supply of papers they issued as receipts. Returning to Bitcoin's violation of Mises Regression theorem. We return now and renew the significance of the question of whether Bitcoin violates Mises Regression theorem, and consider what Saifedean is doing in the construction of his argument about what is good money. Here, Saifedean is drawing out all the optimal qualities of commodities that allow them to most perfectly serve as money, but he's doing it for the purpose of showing why Bitcoin is the optimal medium for money. He's trying to create a supporting argument synthesized with the Austrian school as to why Bitcoin is the best money. We suggest that not only is he breaking the tenets and spirit and constituency of the school of Mises, but he effectively superficially explains away the problem of violating Mises regression theorem. And this superficial explanation certainly doesn't clear Bitcoin. Every single aspect that Saifedean draws from what is good money versus what is bad money, in which he ascribes all of the good qualities to Bitcoin, exactly do not describe a non-monetary based usefulness. He most perfectly cuts out anything but a non-monetary usefulness in an attempt to show that Bitcoin has all of the properties he finds that traditional good money mediums had. Although Saifedeanians might count on the labor involved in understanding this point to protect them from the disapprobation of the general reader, the Misesians won't overlook this error. Saifedean explains away the entire endeavor of Mises to fix the problem of Menger's otherwise circular argument. Saifedean, like Mises, wants us to understand it's not an issue in the first place, and he will explain why. On the Misesian reluctance to spend the energy to chastise Saifedean's perversion of praxeology. Our Szabonian deconstruction then allows us to suggest that the convenience of having people subscribe to Saifedean's synthetic construction of Bitcoin and the Austrian school was convenient, since not only did it seem to sufficiently, although with invalid reasoning that the public doesn't realize is invalid, defend their school against the problem of Bitcoin's discordance with the Mises Regression theorem. But if it was ever discovered how invalid and ridiculous it was, then they could just disband from him anyways, and likewise him from them. Such a circumstance seems easy to relate metaphorically to historical times, where one awaits a besiegement of one's walls while watching a further off smaller sister city of a shared culture suffer their own fate from the besieger prior. It's no longer for the writers of our time to provide such historical examples, but rather for ChatGTP, allowing for brevity and timeless context of examples. On correlation versus causation of good or bad money standards and times of war versus economic prosperity. Saifedean continues to compare the history of economic circumstances of the world with the money standard of the time. Quote, with the majority of the world on one sound monetary unit, there was never a period that witnessed as much capital accumulation, global trade, restraint on government, and transformation of living standards worldwide. Not only were the economies of the West far freer back then, the societies themselves were far freer. This world came crashing down in the catastrophic year 1914, which was not only the year of the outbreak of World War I, but the year that the world's major economies went off the gold standard and replaced it with unsound government money. A praxeologist would never allow such points to taint their argument. Here we would want to state we feel it's important and useful to make such a comparison. However, we agree with what we feel Mises would point out, which is that it would be a mistake to simply assert that good money of the time is the cause of peace and prosperity, as if an emperor or government could decree it, any more than they could decree the peace and prosperity itself. The problem of economics is the problem of natural-based scarcity in the face of human choice and action. We would like to suggest that all significant and reasonable economic schools would deny it possible for an emperor or government to increase the level of prosperity of an economy simply by declaring their money to be of the Saifedean standard he paints. Different than asserting or noting that these two phenomena may be bound to each other in some way. We assert that it would be to axiomize away the problem of economics that any school means to acquire into, something Menger, Mises, and Hayek each warned against. On remedies of falling into quicksand. As a shortcut for understanding and expressing the implication of Saifedean's account of the history of economy versus the history of money standards, we would like to offer the image of Homer Simpson reaching down into quicksand to pull his own legs out. From experience and intuition, we caution the general reader that Saifedean might try to use the synthesis of a Homer quicksand escape construction to resolve the discordance pointed out with the absurdity of implying an economy can declare itself into prosperity. On the possible other explanations as to the observable relations between the prosperity of economies and their monetary standards as measured by Saifedean hardness. Our natural and obvious view of the apparent correlation between money standards by the Saifedean measure and the economic harmony of the time is to consider the quality of money as a ratio of the savings of the economy, so that in times of strife, the people of the currency use inflation to socialize their own welfare. While the libertarian sees this as a type of theft and tax, it would well explain the correlation, but without any unjust power given to the sovereign to fix or want to fix the problem through the inflation of the money standard. In such a scenario, the people would be unable to feed themselves if they couldn't inflate their money to do so. We will put forth an argument that might support that possibility, but it's not necessary for such an argument to be fleshed out or to be valid in order for it to illuminate another of Saifedean's abuse of claiming to extend an argument from the Austrian school. Thus we have used Szabonian deconstruction to reveal the original nature of Mises and the Austrian school, thus illuminating and invalidating Saifedean's wrapping of it. In the following passage, Saifedean seems not to have remembered the beginning of his own rambling, else his argument boils down to prosperity we seek through sound money will lead us to ruin. Quote, "This might have been feasible when the population was highly educated and knowledgeable about the dangers of unsound money, but with every passing generation displaying the intellectual complacence that tends to accompany wealth. Nonetheless, you can understand the contrasting view we paint when we consider whether or not inflation may be one day historically viewed as a type of cooperation that allowed civilizations to stave off many types of economic starvation." Quote, "The siren song of con artists and court jester economists would prove increasingly irresistible for more of the population, leaving only a minority of knowledgeable economists and historians fighting an uphill battle to convince people that wealth can't be generated by tampering with the money supply, that allowing a sovereign the control of the money can only lead them to increasing their control of everyone's life." A deconstruction of Saifedean Rapp's historical inflation observations. We can understand this in terms of socializing defense in times of war as well, whereas Saifedean wants us to believe history is correctly and usefully wrapped in his bias. Quote, "With the simple suspension of gold redeemability, governments' war efforts were no longer limited to the money that they had in their own treasuries, but extended virtually to the entire wealth of the population, for as long as the government could print more money and have that money accepted by its citizens and foreigners, it could keep financing the war." Here we can think of the complexity distance between the above Saifedean wrapper in the context of funding war and how a libertarian would wrap central banking much the same. The Saifedean would certainly appease the libertarian Misesian and libertarian Bitcoiner while simultaneously leaving a nation unable to defend itself versus an immoral conqueror if it were to adopt the decree of the Saifedean money standard. Saifedean wrapping of the Bretton Woods outcome by wrapping Keynes. Saifedean references a broader view of the global monetary system via a citation to Hayek. Quote, "A monetary system which Hayek named monetary nationalism in a brilliant short book of the same name." Quote by Hayek. "By monetary nationalism, I mean the doctrine that a country's share in the world's supply of money should not be left to be determined by the same principles and the same mechanism as those which determine the relative amounts of money in its different regions or localities." Back to Saifedean. "A truly international monetary system would be one where the whole world possessed a homogeneous currency such as obtains within separate countries and where its flow between regions was left to be determined by the results of the action of all individuals. Never again would gold return to being the world's homogeneous currency with central banks' monopoly position and restrictions on gold ownership forcing people to use national government monies. The introduction of Bitcoin as a currency native to the internet superseding national borders and outside the realm of governmental control offers intriguing possibility for the emergence." He then references the Bretton Woods Conference outcome, noting it to be so bad it makes Keynes look not so unhinged. This is because Keynes' proposal was not chosen for the new monetary order as a result of this conference. Quote, "In the battle for centrally planned global monetary orders, White was to emerge victorious with a plan that even made Keynes look not entirely unhinged. However, Saifedean wraps the flaws in the new system as being Keynesian." Quote, "In the Bretton Woods system, however, governments were dominated by Keynesian economists who viewed activist fiscal and monetary policy as natural and important part of government policy." Why does he make this strange construction? because Keynesian economics is the school of thought that argues for the use and socialization of the devaluation of an economy's money in order to combat times of economic difficulty. If Keynesianism was held or observed as natural truth, the Saifedean system would be inconsistent, like we suggested it could be before. Noting a decline in a civilization's money standard might only be a measure of the civilization's decline, not the cause of it. Keynes' proposal for the new economy being decided at Bretton Woods was effectively the Bancor, a global supranational currency unit scarcely supplied by a cooperative body of nations. Quote, this is from Wiki. The Bancor was a supranational currency that John Maynard Keynes and E.F. Schumacher conceptualized in the years 1940 to 1942, and which the United Kingdom proposed to introduce after World War II. The name was inspired by the French bank or bank gold. This newly created supranational currency would then be used in international trades as a unit of account within a multilateral clearing system, the International Clearing Union, which would also need to be founded. This ascribes to the same role that Saifedean ascribes to Bitcoin. Although Saifedean won't admit it, we will show later in our essays. It's important then that Saifedeans learn from their messenger Saifedean that Keynes is the devil and that his name shall only be brought up in vain. It makes sense then that he brings up Keynes' lifestyle choices and points out his homosexuality and alleges a pedophilic nature, as if a perfect synthetic construction of Machiavelli and Smith's theory of moral sentiments. On the comparison of salt and cows as money from a praxeological dissection. That cattle, to Saifedean's argument, are money, and good money when considering their quality of being able to walk, it's interesting that he would also mean to suggest that salt is also a good money. In the following, we left in the comments on language as both an example of a praxeologically invalid invocation, as well as probably similarly invalid construction about the origin of language and implication it supports his arguments. Quote, cattle continue to play a monetary role today, with many societies using them for payments, especially dowries. Being bulky and not easily divisible, however, meant cattle were not very useful to solve the problems of divisibility across scales, so another form of money coexisted along with cattle, and that was salt. Salt was easy to keep for long durations and could be easily divided and grouped into whatever weight was necessary. These historical facts are still apparent in the English language, as the word pecuniary is derived from pecus, the Latin word for cattle, while the word for salary is derived from sol, the Latin word for salt. For Saifedean, where cows fall short of being good money, for example their lack of divisibility, salt takes on the monetary role. It's not a stretch to the common reader to suggest salt is money, nor cows, as in different fields of study they are often referred to as such in different ways, for different reasons, with different constructions and different usefulness for those constructions. Here, we argue Saifedean is reaching into the general reader's imagination to fill in the reasoning behind cows being money on the one hand because of their mobility, and salt being money on the other hand because it fulfills the qualities of money that cows don't have. Put another way, it's as if Saifedean is simply listing the historical accounts of things we call money, whether at their time or as a construction looking back on their time, and calling things that support his argument good money, and those that don't less than a good money on a scale that helps him make his argument. One could jokingly assume that Saifedean might argue birds were at one time good money because they can fly, but then not so good money because they don't drown as well as rhinestones. Cherry-picking the history of money quality of mediums that support one's argument is a cheap parlor trick way to sell snake oil. On the nature of cows as money above and beyond simply a commodity of trade. It's for the Saifedean student to explain without synthetic construction how and when cows become money and then not money again, and when and where. At least then we could explain how. Saifedean says, cattle continue to play a monetary role today, with many societies using them for payments, especially dowries. Does this mean they are money? That they are used for payments and dowries? All such objects used in dowries are money? Land is money? What is it about cattle that makes them more money and simply not commodities for trade? It can't be because people make payments for them. That's not a money-only quality. To say something you make a payment with is therefore money is a semantic fallacy of reasoning. Are cattle money because people keep them for later as an intermediate commodity to sell on the market for goods they want after first buying it with some other goods? And what of the milk they produce and the land they need and the food they eat? Is this really an intermediate commodity, a medium of exchange, or the product of land and labor, and a commodity the cattle owner brings to the market or gives to another? Is it because the cattle can be used to buy anything on the market, aka they are the most saleable good? Although no doubt, for much of mankind, one of the largest, most indivisible goods or money of the market commodities available. None of these things, no doubt to the surprise of Saifedeanians, are points of cattle being used as money rather than a commodity. On the nature of salt, or this or that, as money above and beyond simply a commodity of trade. We find that the same empty argument in the treatment of salt of the Saifedean synthesis of the Austrian school in Bitcoin. Does he mean to suggest that someone came to the market with a bag of salt in order to make their purchase? That their employer paid them in salt because it was easier to pay them in salt than the commodities they produced together? Or the commodities that the salt earner would rather have than salt? And Saifedean claims in this that we have a dual purpose, that coincidentally this rescues cows from their only deficiency is money, their indivisibility, since salt is the hero of divisibility. But we also have a new example of a quality of money that Bitcoin also has. Quote by Saifedean, note that this quality is a monetary quality, divisibility. What is the problem of declaring salt as money for Saifedean's argument? Shouldn't then bread, ale, wheat, eggs, food all count as money, depending if the laborer either saves them or takes them to the market? But they don't have divisibility like a cow. Saifedean would say all are of course good monies, not only because they are divisible, but edible as well. Chickens too are good money because you can use them to lay and hatch more money and perhaps eggs. Although we will learn in the next section, no doubt Saifedean would say of chickens as money, soon emperors would destroy their empires by overlaying and hatching them. On blaming monetary policy for the fall of empires. Saifedean explains of our current system with no sympathy to the Keynesian notion of socializing economic uncertainties. The reduction in the purchasing power of money is similar to a form of taxation or expropriation, reducing the real value of one's money even while the nominal value is constant. And he gives this framing with a strong implication that sound policy, enacted by government, would imply prosperity, blaming civilizations whose currency inflated out of existence on their own policy-based demise. Quote, this helps explain why civilizations prosper under a sound monetary system, but disintegrate when their monetary systems are debased, as was the case with the Romans, the Byzantines, and modern European societies. The contrast between the 19th and 20th centuries can be understood in the context of the move away from sound money and all the attendant problems that create. He goes on to make the point about it in a way that is unmistakable. He means to teach the world how to have money that supports prosperity. Quote, what matters in money is its purchasing power, not its quantity, and as such, any quantity of money is enough to fulfill the monetary functions as long as it is divisible and groupable enough to satisfy the holder's transactions and storage needs. Any quantity of economic transactions could be supported by a money supply of any size as long as the units are divisible enough. We note here the use of the qualifier divisible enough, and point out how convenient it is that there is a sufficient but undefined level of divisibility necessary. This leads us to ask, how divisible are cows in this sense? With an entirely cherry-picked reframing of history to support the extension of his claimed Austrian school roots, with an argument that breaks the axioms of one of its leading founders he cites over 50 times, and an argument that runs antithetical to anthropological views of historical evidence, Saifedean declares the deduction of what is the theoretical ideal money, which happens to fit Bitcoin and in his view, only Bitcoin. Quote, a theoretically ideal money would be one whose supply is fixed, meaning nobody could produce more of it. Does Saifedean know what he's done in regard to attempting to extend the Austrian school with a praxeologically invalid argument? Here we ask, if Saifedean is not a professor at the Austrian school, then what is he a professor of? Certainly not logic. A truthful deduction implicit from an otherwise assumed consistent view of Saifedean's construction. As a side note, it could never be argued from a Saifedean that on the one hand, a theoretically ideal money would be one whose supply is fixed, meaning nobody could produce more of it, and yet on the other, any economic agents ever turn to a second or alternate medium of money because their first and primary one didn't have sufficient amounts of units or divisibility. Otherwise, does he mean to argue to such agents that they preferred a secondary money but against their own better judgment of what is ideal? Readers might not understand why we point this out. It's really not a good way to start a chess game. Paradoxically, perhaps for the Saifedean, they must defend against both the secondary use of a money because the primary wasn't divisible enough, but also not in total supply enough. By Saifedean's reasoning, other than the initial need for sufficient divisibility, these can't be reasons to adopt a secondary money. It would be a curious experiment to see if the Saifedean school, out of survival, in the face of historical evidence supported by anthropology, showed that agents did in fact often find a better money because their primary one wasn't divisible or abundant enough, and wonder if they would invoke the praxeological clause that you can't disprove Austrian-based economic arguments with empirical evidence. We'll go into this. On salability. Salability is a key concept to Saifedean's arguments. Throughout his argument, he builds up a construction of Menger's origin of money, based on Menger's idea that goods have a degree of salability. Here he cites Menger's entire book. Quote, "From examining such human choices in market situations, Carl Menger, the father of the Austrian School of Economics and founder of marginal analysis in economics, came up with an understanding of the key property that leads to a good being adopted freely as money on the market, and that is salability, the ease with which a good can be sold on the market whenever its holder desires, with the least loss in its price. The relative salability of goods can be assessed in terms of how well they address the three facets of the problem of the lack of coincidence of wants mentioned earlier: their salability across scales, across space, and across time. A decent simile for salability for the general reader of today's time is liquidity and idealness of transport and storage properties. Low cost to transport and doesn't decay. Saifedean points to the salability across time as equivalent to storing value. Quote, "It is the third element, salability across time, which is the most crucial. A good salability across time refers to its ability to hold value in the future, allowing the holder to store wealth in it, which is the second function of money, store of value." And then notes that not too drastic rate of supply is necessary for that value. Quote, "For the good to maintain its value, it is also necessary that the supply of the good not increase too drastically during the period which the holder owns it." What he means to do and will continue to do in his argument is argue that each money medium of its time was the most saleable good, and that the properties of these monies coincidentally all have are actually not coincidental, and that Bitcoin happens to have all these properties is also not coincidental to his findings. What he can't do is claim that Bitcoin is the most saleable good because it has been valued as being so above all other goods. This would be nonsensical by Menger's account. Bitcoin, Saifedean must argue, is the ideal money because it has all of the same properties that the most saleable goods historically had, like divisibility, even though Bitcoin itself is not saleable. We'll go into this. Revisiting Mises' construction of Menger. How far must we traverse Menger in order to validate or invalidate Saifedean? No distance. Menger's concept of salability is measurement of a commodity's moneyness, but in regard to the origins of money before money and money-based prices can exist. Consider Mises Regression theorem as an earlier synthetic construct by Mises to resolve the problem of how money inherits its salability-based commodity valuation. To consider it as a construct is our addition, that he explores how money inherits its ability to serve a medium of exchange from its commodity-based salability scoring is commonly accepted. How does money get its market valuation? From its pre-money salability valuation. But if it has no salability valuation based on its use as a money, where did it get its initial valuation? From its valuation as a non-monetarily useful commodity, Mises proclaims. On salability as the cause of an object becoming money. Salability isn't obtained from becoming a money, it is stated as the prerequisite to natural transition to it, and a previous market value is the crux of the concept of it. It seems, through our Szabonian deconstruction of Saifedean's construction of Menger, we have usefully deconstructed Mises and revealed a nuanced understanding of Menger and the unresolved issue Mises meant to address with his construction. Under the framework of Menger, which Saifedean claims to extend, how does Bitcoin get its salability with no non-monetary use case but before it becomes a money? On the salability of Bitcoin. Salability relies on the ability to exchange the good in question at the economic price of the time, where an uneconomic price is defined as, quote, the price of a commodity may be denoted as uneconomic on two grounds. This is Menger. One, in consequence of error, ignorance, caprice, and so forth. Two, in consequence of the circumstances that only a part of the supply is available to the demand, the rest, for some reason or other, being withheld, and the price in consequence not commensurate with the actually existing economic situation. The general reader is no doubt confused because in this observation and scenario there is not yet money for market prices to be evaluated. This matters not, however, since what we want to call attention to is the salability of Bitcoin as an already established post-Menger origin of money world, when the cost to transact Bitcoin renders everyday coffee-type transactions absurd, as well as the observation that there is hardly a market price for Bitcoin almost anywhere today, and it's illegal in many ways in many countries. There's an exchange price, but not a market price. Even today in 2025, you still can't directly pay for things with Bitcoin almost anywhere. To be clear, the author, that's me, supports the view that Bitcoin is likely to be a boon for society, but at this time its salability is not ideal and optimal. In fact, by these points and Menger's definition, Bitcoin isn't very saleable at all. Consider that political implications matter. Quote by Menger, the restrictions imposed politically and socially on their being transferred from one period of time to another. That's affects the quality of salability, he's saying. If the argument from Saifedean is that it will eventually arise to be, then we rest our case that he is not at all schooled in any Austrian economics whatsoever and has never once read Menger's Origin of Money. He would be ironically trapped in the circularity Mises denied could ever be an issue. On Menger's definition of money. In Menger's On the Origins of Money, he outlines the framework of his inquiry into what he refers to as an enigma. Quote, there is a phenomenon which has from of old and in particular degree attracted the attention of social philosophers and practical economists. The fact of certain commodities, these being in advanced civilizations coined pieces of gold and silver, together subsequently with documents representing those coins, becoming universally acceptable media of exchange. That every economic unit in a nation should be ready to exchange his good for little metal discs apparently useless as such, or for documents representing the latter, is a procedure so opposed to the ordinary course of things. It must not be supposed that the form of coin or document employed as current money constitutes the enigma in this phenomenon. We may look away from these forms and go back to earlier stages of economic development, or indeed to what still obtains in countries here and there where we find these precious metals in an uncoined state serving as the medium of exchange, and even certain commodities, cattle, skins, cubes of tea, slabs of salt, cowrie shells, etc., still we are confronted by this phenomenon. We still have to explain why it is that the economic man is ready to accept a certain kind of commodity even if he doesn't need it, or if his need of it is already supplied in exchange for all the goods he has brought to the market, while it is nonetheless what he needs that he consults in the first instance with respect to the goods he intends to acquire in the course of his transactions. What is the nature of those little discs or documents which in themselves seem to serve no purpose, and which nevertheless, in contradiction to the rest of experience, pass from one hand to another in exchange for the most useful commodities, nay, for which every one is so eagerly bent on surrendering his wares? Is money an organic member in the world of commodities, or is it an economic anomaly? Are we to refer its commercial currency and its value in trade to the same causes conditioning those of other goods, or are they the distinct product of convention and authority? Here we can see where Saifedean inherited the implication that these things listed can be assumed to have been money without proper qualifications as to how, why, or their context, and more specifically begin to deconstruct money from Menger's view of it. Menger wraps money. Menger doesn't really take the time to define money other than what is implied by the framework of his inquiry, but here we see him use it synonymously with medium of exchange. Quote, "The enigmatic phenomenon of money is even at this day without an explanation that satisfies, nor is there yet agreement on the most fundamental questions of its nature and functions. Even at this day we have no satisfactory theory of money, the idea which lay first to hand for an explanation of the function of money as a universal current medium of exchange. The problem that is to be solved, to wit, the explaining how it has come to pass that certain commodities, the precious metals at certain stages of culture, should be promoted amongst the mass of all other commodities and accepted as the generally acknowledged media of exchange. It is a question concerning not only the origin but also the nature of money and its position in relation to all other commodities." On the Szabonian deconstruction of money. This brings us to the second reason for the essay that we might illuminate a problem with economic philosophers of humanity. We can now put to good use our concept and syntax for Szabonian deconstruction. What we are alluding to and discovering at this point is the problem with observing the history of an object that over time itself evolves to solve an evolving problem. This is the tightest way we feel we should point to this. If we explain it more accurately with words like money, we might have been too specific and exclusive in the definition we imply, etc. Consider that over the history of man, we haven't had until recently much evidence to go on to see the evolution of money in relation to the evolution of the changing circumstances of its corresponding time, nor time for the great thinkers to reevaluate their works past a single lifetime. Our suggestion here is that the authors would have been more careful to first define the nature and the context of the money they wish to observe and philosophize about with their readers. Such a deconstruction might be represented like this: history of money wraps money. But of course an infinite regress of wrapping if we want to show all of the history of writers of money that read and wrote of other such writers. On the usefulness of the concept of wrapped money versus cherry-picking empirical observations of it. In a future paper, we mean to illuminate ideas for reviewing the entirety of the history of money. For now, we mean to point to the wrappability, the easiness to wrap and the memeability of the wrappings of money over its history, and how we not only seem intent with wrapping it in explanation, but also that money itself can be examined for evidence of evolution layers, like rings on a tree. We feel this method, although more complex and involving more effort, will probably yield to be more useful, i.e. it will mean better, than simply pointing at historical examples of things we called money and looking for favorable commonalities. On vertical and horizontal distance complexity in regard to the origins of money and the recursive and curious nature of wrapping money. That in some sense we can think of similar money scenarios or mediums as having different wrappers but parallel or horizontal functions, or that we can think of some circumstance in which wrapping money of a time is necessary for it to serve some culture evolution and see this as vertical distance. These are loose ideas of which we are taking the opportunity presented in this essay to briefly present before we fully expound on them in later writings. By recursive, we mean to suggest that as we traverse the vertical depth of history of money wraps money, we should find wrapper upon wrapper of useful evolutions of it. Of course, the distinctions we call wrappers are subjectively ascribed, but we will eventually have given a strongly defined framework constructed from a synthesis with Szabo's work in order to tease the most properly useful wrappers of money out. In regard to the saleability of shells and referencing Nick Szabo's shelling out as confirmation, Saifedean cites Szabo and makes the assertion that seashells, being used as money around the world throughout history, are an example that scarcity and being difficult to find caused the most saleable seashells to rise to the top of the saleability gauntlet, becoming money. Quote by Saifedean. Seashells are another monetary medium that was widely used in many places around the world from North America to Africa and Asia. Historical accounts show that the most saleable seashells were usually the ones that were scarcer and harder to find, because these would hold more value than the ones that can be found easily. Notice Saifedean provides no historical evidence of the claim that the saleability of the shells the markets ordered caused them to value the scarcest the most. We would like to suggest that this is an ignorant assumption by Saifedean meant to fool his readers, unsupported by archaeology and anthropology, and unsupported by Nick Szabo in his essay Shelling Out. In Szabo's work, it is possible for non-scarce items combined with some process that provides costly unforgeability to become what he calls proto-money. This means he doesn't expect necessarily that the most scarce and hard to find or the most saleable shells arose to become money. It is very important because Szabo is a very well-learned polymath that would be quite embarrassed to have made the mistake that Saifedean confers on him via his citation. It would of course be quite convenient to point out that historically most rare and money-like commodities become money, and that Bitcoin has these exact money-like qualities, and that therefore Bitcoin is and will be held as the best money. But Szabo's essay isn't meant to explain that rare things get value simply because they are rare, or scarce things are valued and valued because they are scarce, however we want to define scarce. In fact, his essay means to explain that very paradox with the concept of the seemingly otherwise wasteful process that somehow instills value in otherwise potentially valueless objects. He means to explain why we might be a collectible type of society, and this doesn't support the idea that we are able to and do naturally value scarce things, simply because they are scarce. They are scarce, we value them, we want to understand why. Szabo is deconstructing Menger. Menger wraps money. Saifedean is constructing a construction of money. Saifedean wraps Szabo, who wraps Menger, wraps money. Szabo is speaking to the apparent failure of the Austrian School of Economics to consider how a medium or object that hasn't had a previous market-based value might be instilled with such a value. That is to say, Szabo's argument precludes the necessity of the Mises Regression theorem as a resolving synthesis to Menger's work and emerging economic theories. Saifedean is trying to extend Menger and skipping the regression paradox by wrapping Szabo with the implication that Szabo wrapped Menger, but Szabo deconstructed Menger. Saifedean's construction falls apart. Szabo shows scarcity is an outcome of our culture habits and institution. The reader is invited to test the idea that money is an artifact of practical usefulness. Saifedean's argument rather relies on our want for scarcity to be the cause of our culture and habits. He can't cite Szabo for this with consistency. Ask Szabo. On the idea of markets participants in historical civilizations ordering shells by saleability. Saifedean's readership is no doubt fooled by the concept of a pre-money price. Imagine a market where there is no money of the time, no unit of account. How does a trader, in the fervor of a marketplace of many goods and many types of shells, for whatever reason they are valued in the market we don't know but are curious about, decide that one shell over another will fetch the economic price of its time more so than another shell? Economic price here means to be able to trade the shells for what they are worth in the goods you are trading them for at any time you want to trade them. Keeping in mind that to not have a unit of account and to not have a money is to trade shells among all other things for the price determined in each of those things. Does Saifedean mean to argue that early man took account of all this and used rational deduction to order the saleability of his shells? Does he know that it is the work of Hayek, to which no doubt Saifedean credits his argument, he couldn't dare try to credit Mises, to say that such calculations are increasingly unscalable? Were there many types of shells on this market before the most saleable arose to be money? Furthermore, in regard to saleability across time, we are expected to believe that the early proto-money traders would make rational considerations on the futurity of the supplies of each shell such that they ordered their saleability and accurately landed on the shells that were the most scarce and hard to find. I would like to see the records of this that must then exist. There is certainly no account of this in the history of man. It's absurd to think that there would be. Szabo doesn't reference one. On the possibility of a money medium arising as a byproduct of an unrelated action. In our theory that extends Szabo, we argue that shells were available intrinsically as a byproduct of other actions, such as eating. This still doesn't put them on the market, but our theory explains that as well. Saifedean's theory is that the value in endowed commodities with otherwise no market value is derived from their scarcity and difficulty to find. On the effects of the saleability of rhinestones when adding them to an economy. If we consider rhinestones somehow as good money that don't move, aren't at all divisible, but do move from social order and do divide by social order and can be lost under the sea forever, but can't be stolen or lost because of social code, we can think about their scarcity in regard to the cost to make or get more stones. We're using Saifedean's argument. This is why it sounds so awkward. Does a villager think to themselves, if I go carve a rhinestone, I can be wealthy from only the labor of procuring it? Does the village believe that if they double their rhinestones, they double their wealth, such that they can stop tending to their crops and simply produce rhinestones? These are the anthropological incongruencies that Saifedean's argument implies. Rhinestones are exactly as scarce as their society deemed them to be. This is something all of the other economic schools will support, but paradoxically, or what is unexplainable, is that they aren't then necessarily as valuable as they are scarce. The society doesn't get more or less wealthy depending on the number of rhinestones they have. There is something else involved. That paradox is exactly what Szabo's work explains and exactly what shows Saifedean's argument to be inconsistent. An anthropologically inconsistent construction. His readers can't vet it, and he hopes his argument is too complexly distant from the anthropologist to get caught in the inconsistency. Saifedean's construction of Bitcoin as the most saleable good. Quote, historical accounts show that the most saleable seashells were usually the ones that were scarcer and harder to find, because these would hold value more than the ones that can be found easily. Saifedean's account of the history of saleability of different goods is an attempt to build an argument that Bitcoin is the most saleable good, because it has all the properties that all of the most saleable goods have, minus a reason to have a commodity price in the first place. Saifedean wraps Bitcoin. Saifedean wraps Bitcoin with his own wrapping of Menger by saying that Bitcoin is to be the most saleable good because it has all of the same properties that all of the most saleable goods of the past had. He's not saying or can't say Bitcoin is the most saleable good because it doesn't readily fetch a market price, and less so over time and space. There is sometimes great cost to transact with it, and that cost changes as well as its value. Instead, he's saying that if you look at the properties that the most saleable goods have historically, different from the qualities of salability that Menger lists, you will find Bitcoin to be the commodity that has the most of each of these qualities. On the salability of Bitcoin and Bitcoin exchanges. Exchanges that hold Bitcoin are examples of the effects of the limitations of Bitcoin's salability, increasing the cost and distance as to where the Bitcoins are stored. The mental cost and the legality of holding one's own Bitcoins affect this, and it's a dramatically changing tide. These factors run against the idea of Bitcoin as the most saleable good. This point helps us understand salability in the context of Bitcoin. On the coincidental similarities between the coincidental properties of the most saleable goods and Bitcoin. All that is left is for Saifedean to declare that Bitcoin somehow perfectly has all of the qualities of the most saleable goods of our history. It is such an amazing match that one is left wondering what Saifedean would say if there was ever a quality of a most saleable good of our past that Bitcoin did not possess. It's not a coincidence, Saifedean would say. Satoshi was obviously an Austrian-minded engineer of money. We disagree. We believe Satoshi deconstructed the Austrian school. And of course, Bitcoin doesn't have all of the perfectly ideal qualities of all the things that were known of the history of money, and Satoshi never implied it. Many people custody it for these reasons. Many people avoid it because of the way the law treats it. It's costly to send, its value is not very reliable, it's not stable, it's only socially scarce, it requires electricity to exist, etc. It's very interesting, it's very valuable, but it's also limited in many ways as money. Nick Szabo on Satoshi's brilliance. In fact, it's Szabo in his essay, Blockchains and Social Scalability, that explains of Satoshi that the limitations of Bitcoin as being a perfect money are part of his brilliant design. Quote, "The secret to Bitcoin's success is certainly not its computational efficiency or its scalability in the consumption of resources. Specialized Bitcoin hardware is designed by highly paid experts to perform only one particular function, to repetitively solve a very specific and intentionally very expensive kind of computational puzzle. That puzzle is also called a proof of work. As a result, the Bitcoin's blockchain cannot process as many transactions per second as a traditional payment network, such as PayPal or Visa. Bitcoin offends the sensibilities of resource-conscious and performance measure-maximizing engineers and businessmen alike." Szabo has a different idea for what is the usefulness of Bitcoin. Quote, "Instead, the secret to Bitcoin's success is that its prolific resource consumption and poor computational scalability is buying something even more valuable, social scalability." Szabo highlights not only the existence of the limitations of Bitcoin, but the importance of the acceptance of them. He calls it the observation of Satoshi's brilliant trade-off, effectively trading computational inefficiency for social scalability. Quote, "In computer science, there are fundamental security versus performance trade-offs. These necessary trade-offs, sacrificing performance in order to achieve the security necessary for independent, seamlessly global, and automated integrity, mean that Bitcoin's blockchain itself cannot possibly come anywhere near Visa transaction per second numbers and maintain the automated integrity that creates its distinct advantages versus these traditional financial systems. That is Satoshi's brilliant trade-off." Szabo notes the weaknesses of Bitcoin that Saifedean means to deny. Quote, "Bitcoin supports a lower rate transactions than Visa or PayPal, but due to its stronger automated security, these can be much more important transactions. Anybody with a decent internet connection and a smartphone who can pay 20 cents to $2 transaction fees, substantially lower than the current remittance fees, can access Bitcoin anywhere on the globe. Lower value transactions with lower fees will need to be implemented on peripheral Bitcoin networks." On Saifedean consistency and peripheral Bitcoin networks. Remember that in Saifedean's system, quote, "a theoretically ideal money would be one whose supply is fixed, meaning nobody could produce more of it. We would expect then, in order to resolve the inconsistency of reaching for peripheral Bitcoin networks, that in the Saifedean system, monetary networks that arise to fulfill the qualities of an ideal money that Bitcoin can't fulfill, they would be divided into either two categories. One, those that can be wrapped as Bitcoin, for example, the Lightning Network. 2, those that can't be wrapped as Bitcoin and so must be wrapped with a negative religious stigma. This explains the shitcoin phenomenon of calling other currencies that aren't Bitcoin shitcoin, a wrapper of an ancient tradition of wrapping things we mean to signal as unworthy of consideration with the concept of our feces. Not to say Saifedean system is responsible for the shitcoin calling phenomenon, rather it's a shallow construction to share with other systems that need to adopt it for their own consistency. As silly as the actions are, we think it might be worthwhile to study the deconstruction of such behavior and superficial attempts to stave off death by inconsistency. Now that we understand how to deconstruct Saifedean's system, consider the following excerpt from a YouTube talk he gives. Quote, I think if you're familiar with academic economics, and I say this often, essentially what goes on at universities and most economic think tanks is just excuses for printing money. It's just here's a bunch of money and come up with more stupid canes and ideas and why we need to print money. And of course, a lot of people benefit from all that money printing, and it costs peanuts to get a university professor at some whorehouse like Harvard or Yale or Princeton to come up with excuses for why, yeah, we need to print a bunch of money in order to make things better. It is, and it's the same thing with all of the geopolitics. All these think tanks, all this foreign policy people think there's actual scholarship there. People think those people are anything respectable. In fact, they're just prostitutes. There is no rhyme or reason behind any of this garbage, and it's manufactured as intellectual ideas. You know, all of these people that you mentioned, all of these think tanks, I mean, there is no logic behind any of it, and there's nothing behind that is intellectually defensible. It is all bull. It's a giant edifice that's built on Keynesian bullshit idea that the more we spend, the better off we are. The more we spend on weapons, the better off we are. If we spend money on wars, then it's not a bad thing because, yeah, sure, you know, a lot of innocent people are going to die, but that's just what happens when you're the strongest country in the world. Don't you want to be the strongest country in the world? If we don't do it, others will do it for us. And so we need to keep printing money, and we need to keep killing people, and we need to do this. And of course, you said it's chump change for the military industrial complex, but it's enormous amounts of money for the war of ideas. It's very easy, you know, with Boeing and Ron and Lockheed Martin, chump change. You can shape all of the discourse in all of America's house universities, all of the America's whorehouse think tanks, of all America's whorehouse media. It's very easy. Journalists are very cheap kind of prostitutes, as are university professors, as are all of these despicable pieces of shit in all of these think tanks that are coming up with all of the excuses for why we need to go and kill all of these foreigners, none that make any sense, and there's absolutely no logic to it, and it's all, in my opinion, I keep coming back to it, it all rests on Keynesian foundations, and it all rests on the idea that money printing is costless and military spending is good. This is the military Keynesianism, and it's really very, very, yeah, it's dangerous idea, and it's something that is taught at universities and is absolutely criminal. Is it possible for a system to insert its own consistency any more than this? Observe the tropes. They are all the axioms needed to make the inconsistency of his argument consistent. On time preference and evil wraps inflation. Time preference is another main theme of Saifedean's system, the idea of a more stable or better quality money inspiring one to hold on to it or in order to make more prudent choices, low time preference, than one in a world with inferior money where agents are thus incentivized to spend their money like a hot potato. Keynes is often referred to as saying, in the long run, we are all dead. It is something that those that frantically and vocally argue against what is the wrapping of inflation don't understand. Their observation of Keynes is how much it makes sense to the rational individual to sacrifice a small amount of their quality of their money or even the value of their savings in order to serve the greater economy as a whole in times of strife, knowing that the process will not be felt to the individual and will equilibrate and spans beyond the individual's life. That the general individual doesn't seem concerned about 2% inflation isn't because they're ignorant, fooled, unwise, but rather the observation of Keynes is truthful. This highlights a motivation for a call to take action by Saifedeanians, a crusade to educate and purify the world of unholy falsehoods claiming to be truths. On the low time preference of stakes and type of time preference Saifedean's expensive courses are. The concern is that Saifedean is wrapping the idea of expensive stake as the concept of low time preference choice, but really while convincing his audience that their investment in an inconsistent and anthropologically historically unsound system of economics is a low preference choice. He's really just taking money from unfortunate, downtrodden, unsuspecting persons and using it to make fiat-based investments his system couldn't possibly support without again breaking his own consistency. Stock to flow and Plan B as Plan B. Here we note the shallowness of complexity between our deconstruction of Saifedean's arguments and the claim of a well-known internet personality, Plan B, aka at $1 trillion US. That memes the argument that Bitcoin scarcity, and particularly in regard to its stock to flow, or ratio of additional units to total existing supply, gives it an intrinsic range of value that it will follow. We are noting the shallowness of the distance complexity between these two arguments and suggesting the complexity distance to be nearly non-existent. That is, they have the same conclusion. Saifedean seems to have hundreds and hundreds of pages explaining why, but he's got an inconsistent explanation. So they basically just randomly have the same conclusion with no argument behind it. On Saifedean's inconsistent system and Islam and Islamic authority. It is our recommendation that leaders in Islam declare Saifedean's work unholy. It's not only dangerous to rational logic of Islam, but also to the relationship with Islam and the West, or any entities that Islam would otherwise benefit from peaceable cooperation with. Saifedean's inconsistent system would harm any such potential harmony, corrupting the minds of either side. His ideas, in spirit, should be violently opposed. They are destructive to Islam.